I know it's hard on weekdays. People have things going on, but it's good to see some faces in the room here. If you don't know me, my name is Zach Melcher. I work in the planning department here for the town of North Andover.
We're here today to talk about the Historic Preservation Master Plan, which was something that we identified in our 2018 master plan as a strategy, and we were able to utilize Community Preservation Committee funding to develop this project. And I'm joined by Peter Benton, who has worked on many of these plans across the state, so he knows what he's talking about. And he's here today to give you a great informative presentation. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to him.
Thanks, Zach. And we can go to the next slide. Zach's going to run my slides for me. Thank you. This is our team. Zach and Stan Limpert from the multiple different organizations are serving as project managers. Zach is our primary project manager. And then we have a stakeholder group made of representatives from several of the different organizations. And then our company, Heritage Strategies. We're a small company based in Pennsylvania and Maine. And with only three of us, my wife here is part of it, so we're only missing my partner Elizabeth, who is helping us on the project as well. Our stakeholder group has met only a few times, but I've also talked with them individually with interviews, and they are providing us with guidance with regard, and also introductions to the groups that they represent. Okay. The project schedule runs for a year. And we're in phase 2 right now, and we're just about to go into phase 3, developing recommendations, and I'm just going to run through these 4 phases real quickly. The phase 1 was background. We started in January. We really finished this up in late April, early May, and mostly it was looking at background material from the town in a variety of different categories, which I'm going to talk about. And it was also undertook a field review, spent several days touring the town, taking photographs, and getting to know the landscape. And as a consequence of this, we've produced a number of documents that should be available to the interested organizations. Go ahead. So then in May and June, we started outreach. It was really primarily to reach out to stakeholders. So we've conducted a number of personal interviews. We have not met formally with the boards and commissions of the various entities as a whole, but we've been dealing with individuals on different boards and commissions. And we just completed a townwide survey that was available for about 4 weeks, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit. And this sort of sets us up for this meeting tonight, the public forum, and getting us going on actually developing some recommendations that we can talk with you about. Go ahead. And I'm going to be talking about, some initial recommendations tonight, sort of what we've learned. And the recommendations phase will run into November and December, and really will develop into a draft plan that would be available for you to look at. We're going to be developing chapters on a rolling basis, but for the first thing we're going to do is this outline of strategies and recommendations here that will sort of be organized in the way that we're suggesting that the plan be organized, and that will include the basic recommendations without a lot of background. Once those recommendations are accepted and commented upon by you all and by the town, we'll develop it into a draft plan with the idea of getting a final plan early in the new year. Certainly a draft plan by the end of December. Go ahead. So in phase 1, we produced 5 write-ups, and these write-ups can be made available to you and have been made available to at least the Historical Commission members. And I'm going to walk through each of these: the inventory, National Register listings, partners and stakeholders, planning context, and bylaws and regulations. Go ahead. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the statewide inventory system, But the Massachusetts Historical Commission has a really good system for inventorying historic resources town by town. Primarily, this system is developed for federal and state projects, particularly transportation projects, so that they can know where historic resources are. And North Andover has its own survey. This is a partial map of North Andover, you know, this being the town itself. And the blue dots are resources that have been inventoried, and the red dots, the red areas, are National Register resources, which we'll talk about in a moment. In any case, this is a great system. If you're not aware of it, you're interested in historic resources, you can go to their website, you can see this map, it's interactive. You can click on any one of these dots and see what the resource is, and then you can get guided to the inventory information related to that resource. Anyway, this is a basic tool that we use to understand the distribution and extent of the inventories that have been undertaken within the town. Okay. North Andover has gone through several periods of inventory work. The inventory work is like the basic ground level of understanding what you have in terms of historic resources. In the first two iterations of inventory undertaken by the Historical Society, you know, in between 1967 and 1970, they really targeted what they thought were the most important resources in the town. So these inventories just to get going. And then between 1974 and 1983, they hired Stephen Roper to undertake. He was a graduate student at the time in historic preservation, and he undertook a series of inventories, documented about 98 resources. And between those two resources, they really covered what they thought was then the most important historic resources in the town. And those are really the only historic resource inventories that have been undertaken within the town in the way that historic resource inventories are usually undertaken. However, in addition to those initial inventories undertaken then, you've had 3 National Register nominations prepared, all really very early. 1979, 1982, and 1995. That would be Center Village, Machine Shop Village, and Tavern Acres. The two Center Village and Machine Shop Village National Register nominations were undertaken by the Historical Society, and Tavern Acres was undertaken by the Improvement Society. And these were also instrumental in inventorying the resources within the areas that they're located. And I'll show maps of those in a moment. But they really added to the inventory totals that you have. But between 1998 and the present, we've only had 18 additional historic resource inventories. And some of those were undertaken by the state in the context of transportation projects and other initiatives. So there's really not much inventory work that's been undertaken since 1998. So in summary, in terms of inventory listings, you have 411 listings in MACRIS in the state system. 200 of those involve inventory forms. So you can have a listing without an inventory form. It just lists the name of a building or a resource, but there's no attached inventory form related to it. You have 6 area forms. Area forms are like neighborhoods. They're landscape areas. So within any area, you may have multiple historic resources, and we really recommend using area forms. But you have 6 of those right now. And you have 174 individual historic building forms. The National Register nominations that I mentioned a moment ago accounted for 211 of your listings. So, 411 isn't. It's good, but it's not great. We're working down in Scituate. They have about 1,200, 1,300 individual listings in theirs, and their population is half yours. So, there's more to be done here, and I'll go over that in a moment. In addition, you have listings for monuments, cemeteries, parks, and bridges that were done by the Transportation Department. So this is the Richards map of 1926, and I know you can't read it there, but what you can ascertain is the subdivisions. You can see the properties, subdivisions that were occurred right there, but they weren't built out. They were just laid out, pre-Depression subdivisions. But if you were able to look at this map closer, and some of you may be familiar with it, you'll see yellow buildings that they have actually identified all the buildings that have been built by 1926. And our rule of thumb, my rule of thumb, really with regard to inventories of historic towns in Massachusetts is to really use World War II as a culminating event, because after World War II, towns such as yours began to suburbanize, and before that, you have buildings that are really related to the mills that you have and other entities that didn't survive into the late 20th century. Anyway, there's a lot of buildings on here that were existing by 1926, and certainly more that were existing by the time of the Depression. Okay. So this is going back to the Macris map, and what it shows you is that the areas encircled have not been inventoried, and so all those areas were built up in the map that I showed you in 1926, and yet they have not been inventoried. So what you see here, this is Machine Shop Village, this is Tavern Acres, National Register nominations, they're in red, and the individual dots are individual resources that were surveyed. Really good job on those. But here's downtown, and you see there's only a smattering of buildings that have been inventoried from those areas. Also north on High Street, and also to the east in the Stevens Mill residential areas. These areas have not been inventoried. And go to the next slide. And so these are some of the buildings that exist, which I think most of you would probably agree are of historical interest, and yet they have not been inventoried in those areas. These are all south of downtown. One or two of them may have been inventoried, those blue dots, but the point is that there's a lot of neighborhood areas that have not been inventoried that are related to your mill history in the early 20th century. So there's a real opportunity to continue inventory work in those neighborhoods and in other areas. Okay. As a result of the inventories that Stephen Roper did, ending in 1983, the Historical Society hired him to write the book, which I hope most of you are familiar with. This is a terrific book, really well done, published in 2001, and he did a great job with it. The Historical Society did a great job with it, and we're just lucky to have it. Go ahead. What I like about it is two things. So I have two slides, two things I like about it. The first is the way he developed themes for his chapters, because these themes really do relate to your history, North Andover's history, and we would like to use this going forward in our plan, develop this. And the early farming community, from settlement by Europeans, really up to the development of the mills. Focus on Center Village and as a real place and a concentration, the factory villages around the mills, along the waterways, and then the country seats that developed in the late 19th and early 20th century, mostly around the lake. So that's a really good way to sort out the history and the historical development. It's only lacking two eras, if you will. The pre-European era, which we like to call native landscape because it's related to native peoples, indigenous peoples, who we don't call it natural landscape, we call it native landscape because they managed their landscapes too, so they weren't totally natural. They were influenced, so it's lacking that. And it's also lacking what I would call the post-World War II period of suburbanization that you have been going through up to the present, and which I'll also talk a little bit about going forward. The other thing I like about his book is that he deals holistically with a variety of different topics. He gives you the historic context for each one of those periods and chapters. He talks about the landscapes that are associated with them, architectural styles, building types, and that's two different things. Building types versus what kind of style of architecture they're built in. He also talks about building techniques that evolved over time, And then he gives you examples of both from in each era and each chapel. Really good job, and you're lucky to have it. So if this is the map that is in Roper's book, and getting back to the idea of inventory, so this is the area in the vicinity of Phillips Court, which was a Stevens Mill related area, and it is unsurveyed, uninventoried. And so he shows these buildings in his plan, in his book. He talks about the buildings, he talks about the development, but somehow they never got into his inventory, the Historical Society's inventory. And then looking further southeast in what I've been told is called the Outcountry, which is a name I really like, I find that while Roper's map does not include all of the inventoried resources that you have that we showed on the Macris map, because he's only showing buildings that he's talking about in the book. He does talk about resources that are out here that, and of course Stevens Court as well, that have not been inventoried. And so I'm interested in looking at really what he has identified in this book and seeing, well, what's missing from the inventory, southeast of the lake that would be easily identifiable from comparing the inventory maps to his map in his book. Go ahead. So that's my point on inventory. My point is, and we will be developing recommendations on this, is that there's more inventory work to be done. That's the job of the Historical Commission. And you can use, CPA funding to do that, CPC funding to do that. It's important that we get those other resources inventoried, because that sort of builds the knowledge and local interest, really public interest in neighborhood revitalization, neighborhood preservation in areas that have not been specifically identified, like Machine Shop Village and Center Village. So these are the National Register districts. You have 3 National Register districts. This is, of course, is Center Village, and you can see all the resources, the triangles, the red triangles that have been identified as part of that National Register historic district. And this is Machine Shop Village, which has also done a really good job with, and this is Tavern Acres. It's really, and these were, of course, done in the 79, 82, and 95. And that was the time when, these kinds of things were gaining momentum. It was like the next step after you start doing the inventories is to really get them on the National Register. Now, the National Register is a preservation tool, but it's not regulatory. It's at the federal level. It's managed by the National Park Service, if you're not familiar with it. And it provides professional recognition, national level recognition for the resources that have been listed on the National Register, but there's no regulatory obligations for private property owners that are related to it. But it's an important tool, again, for public outreach, for people to know that they live in an area that has met the criteria necessary to be on the National Register. So these districts are important. And the question is, are there other neighborhoods that should be identified on the National Register that could be developed going forward? We also have a number of individual resources that you are familiar with that have been listed on the National Register. The Cunard Estate, the Kittredge Mansion, 45 acres, Osgood Hill, Stevens Estate, Ridgewood Cemetery, which was done in 2016, and the first period buildings, which were done primarily led by Massachusetts Historical Commission efforts, and you have several here in town. So these are all individually listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and the question is, well, what to do going forward? Now, what we like to now there are likely other buildings in town that could be individually listed on the National Register, and that would be a good thing for anybody who owns one or anybody who can work on an individual nomination. But what we like to suggest rather is thematic nominations, because in a thematic nomination you could take a certain type of building and you can apply it over the whole town, and you can identify the resources that are related to that theme. And depending upon whether the owners are interested or not, they can either become listed on the National Register as part of the thematic nomination, or they will be determined eligible but not listed. And so it all depends upon the property owner's preferences. So there are 3 areas where we think thematic nominations could be developed. The first is the early farmsteads, and that relates to the chapter we're talking about in Rober's book, about the farms that stretch all across the town from the 18th, primarily 18th and 19th centuries. We could also expand the mill neighborhoods that I was talking about that have yet been inventoried. I think an inventory is a first necessary step to do that. But there are other neighborhoods and mill areas that probably could be listed on the National Register. And the third area that seems obvious to us are the country estates. A lot of those have now been adaptively used for other, or developed for other uses, but still they're easily identifiable even though their landscapes have been developed, and it could be the basis of a thematic listing as well. So this is a sort of opportunities going forward. There's no rush about doing any of these, but we would recommend that these are efforts that could be undertaken, again, led by the Historical Commission going forward with regard to the National Register. So the primary, in terms of partners and stakeholders, the primary entities that we're in touch with: Historical Commission, the Old Center Historic District Commission, the Machine Shop Village Neighborhood Conservation District Commission, the Community Preservation Commission, the Historical Society, the Improvement Society, and the trustees of reservations. So, we've reached out to individuals within these entities, and we're looking to have some further conversations, both with individuals and perhaps with groups as a whole. And what we're trying to identify is their interest and how the plan can support their activities, recognizing capacity, what they're able to do, what they're interested to do, and how do they work together. We have, there are other boards, commissions, and committees which we want to relate to, specifically the Conservation Commission, which I'll talk about later. And also we need to be in touch with town staff, town departments, and that's what we're working through with Zach and Jean and Andrew, who are here. And anyway, so our goal, we have already reached out to quite a number of individual conversations, but we need to continue that over the next couple months and broaden it and make sure that we're getting a full range of opinions and observations and issues related to these entities and to historic preservation in North Andover as a whole. One of the documents that we prepared was an historic context, where we really look at your planning documents and try to understand where the town's been, where it's going, and what its interests are. The most important are the master plan and the open space plan. With regard to the master plan, and this, by the way, is a project of the master plan. It was recommended in the 2018 master plan, and they did a really good job in their historic preservation section, and we are looking to build on that. So, just looking at a few points that the master plan made that are giving us a sense of the town as a whole, is first that it's been a commuter suburb, since World War II, as I mentioned. Actually, that 1926 map was related to streetcars, so it was a commuter suburb before then, but related to streetcars. Since streetcars went away in the 1920s, it's become an auto commuter suburb, and 78% of residents commute elsewhere to work, so it's a bedroom community largely as well. And the interest of the town in maintaining a robust commercial, industrial, and business environment, supporting the basic tax base, so you can pay for the things that you, the quality of life that you have here, and the shift from more recently, the shift from suburban development to redevelopment, infill, mixed use, other goals. And you can see this as I drive around, and I'm going to talk about this again in another map. You can see that, I don't want to say you're built out, but you don't have a lot of place for large-scale subdivisions anymore. So, the focus has been to draw back in and, redevelop in the areas around downtown, and we'll talk about that in a moment too. And I just want to point out the success of the Davis and Ferber redevelopment. I mean, we're using that as a model. I mean, there are others across the state. People have done that. They did a great job, and I'm just hoping that everybody feels that way. It certainly looks successful, and we're using it as models in areas that towns that have mill development that haven't yet reached that level of redevelopment. So it's a real plus. Activating downtown has been a focus of the master plan, and I'm going to talk about that again in a moment. Related to that is historic neighborhoods, because as development continues to occur, the neighborhoods are going to get increasingly desirable for people to live in, and it ends up involving intensification, which provides pressure on historic buildings, which is why we want to get that inventory done so we know what we've got in terms of historic neighborhoods. So the downtown revitalization, we are looking for any way that we can help with this as it goes forward, and we think it's the right thing to do, and we support it wholeheartedly. Our goal would be to emphasize its historic character, preserve historic buildings, adaptively reuse historic buildings. Our goal, our interest is in redevelopment, new development, infill that is context sensitive. And so for the future, that you're really building on your historic character, making it as people-friendly as possible, and have it in an active, vital center for the town as a whole. And this is a map from the master plan that just shows potential redevelopment sites and so forth. And the buildings that you have built there are good, I feel, in terms of scale and character. So we commend those buildings, especially down in the South Main area that have come in. And so we're looking for how we can support this effort in a way that builds on historic character and puts the town's historic character at the forefront. But going along with downtown revitalization and the sort of increase of redevelopment and infill, that's going to place pressure on those neighborhoods that I'm talking about south of downtown. And right now, there's nothing in place in terms of regulatory review or even sort of public outreach and encouragement to make sure that those neighborhoods are recognized in terms of the quality of their character, the quality of the buildings, and the buildings are appropriately treated. We want to, it's possible that those neighborhoods could become National Register districts. It's possible they become local historic districts or neighborhood conservation districts in them themselves, or you just work with homeowners and try to encourage the appropriate treatment of historic buildings. Above all, we want to prevent building loss in those areas. And most of the buildings are large. The building loss is more related to the small scale buildings that you have in Machine Shop Village. People come in and they say a small building and it's on a desirable lot. They tear it down and build a mansion. That won't happen in Machine Shop Village because it's got the neighborhood conservation district, and rightfully so. But it could happen elsewhere. But as I say, the buildings are fairly substantial buildings. Some of them are multifamily, which is also good in terms of downtown and mixed use and so on. But we want to prevent, as the neighborhoods continue to develop over time, as developers and property owners continue to look to maximize their properties, we want to make sure that we're not losing historic buildings, that we're preserving historic buildings, and that new development occurs within and around the neighborhoods and is, again, context-sensitive design. We want to, no, go back. mostly we want to promote appropriate treatment of historic buildings, and so I'll talk about that more. And also, I want to commend the city, the town, on the streetscape and other enhancements that they've been undertaking even while I've been here. I've seen curbs and road work and stuff like that going forward. And I want to mention the possibility of neighborhood associations. I know over in Beverly, we prepared a plan for Beverly, and they have a very active neighborhood association system. And it's something, if we don't have it here, it's something that neighborhoods could. You really have to have them from the grassroots. Okay. And there are places where redevelopment can occur. It certainly seems to me the Sutton Mill area. We're really interested in the trail connections, building those enhancements, connecting South Main, or is that South? We call that South. The far end of Main here near Sutton School, across Sutton Mill, Sutton Street, across through the lakes over to the Davis and Ferber areas. The pedestrian connectivity, we want to encourage that. We want to try and take advantage of that to talk about perhaps interpretation that would be educational in nature. Go ahead. This is my favorite map. I know you can't read it, but this is a surface geology map. So, and it really talks about historic land use. And so historic land use in Massachusetts is really related to glacial topography. And that's what this map shows. So this is North Andover. Here's the lake and the boundary here and the boundary here. And so you're really in the center on a diagonal from in this map. And what is interesting to me, so the light green is what they call shallow or thin till. The dark green is called thick till, and many of those thick till areas are actually drumlins, hills like Weir Hill. I guess yellow or orange areas are what they call coarse aggregate, be gravel and sand. And then the purple areas are swamp. And intermixed with all that, you see bits of red. The red is where there's ledge. And so what's really interesting about this is, to me, is that you can draw a line right here. And to the north of that, you've got the green. To the south, you've got the purple and the yellow. And this also corresponds to your drainage pattern. From here, you drain north to the Merrimack, and from here, you drain south to other rivers that are further to the south and east. And so these are really headwaters. These swamp areas, these ponds and so on are really headwaters. And so this really relates to how the land was used early on by the farmers when they farmed. Where did they place their farms? Well, the best farms were in the till. The soil's better, it's flatter, less rocks. I'm not sure about that, but the southeastern portion of the town has the much more wetlands, much more swampy areas, much more of ledge, and so if you look at the farms that still remain today, they're pretty much all in the till areas. And so right now, I mean, the advantage of this is twofold. Right now, this area is mostly wooded, which really creates a wonderful environment. And your scenic roads, your beautiful scenic roads, the ponds and so on, the woodlands. And when they came, post World War II, when the suburban development happened, you didn't really have large land areas for large-scale suburban development. So the suburban development that you had is really smaller scale. Compared to what happened in other places. And so it's much more, especially with the growth of the trees back, the woods back, it creates a really beautiful environment for suburban residential life. And there's not a whole lot more area that can be developed, suburban areas. So it's going to be bits and pieces, infill, and so on. So I'm interested in this with regard to historic landscape character and how the land was used especially over the 2 centuries where agriculture was important. So enough. And that really leads us to also the open space plan. The relationship, what we try to do is forge a relationship between the Historical Commission and the Conservation Commission, because they're really 2 sides of the same coin. And when you're trying to preserve historic farmland, you really have to do that as a conservation easement or a conservation restriction. That's really the best way to save that agricultural land that's remaining. But these lands are also historically significant, both in terms of the buildings, but also in terms of the landscape. So there's a real potential for collaboration there. We're really, impressed and supportive of the watershed protection district, and a lot of that area is where your country mansions are, and so there is a fair amount of landscape that's preserved there. So to us, historic preservation and land conservation go hand in hand, and the 2 can work together to some ends. A lot of conservation organizations are interested or unwilling to preserve the historic resources on the land they're conserving. That's where the historic preservationists need to come in as partners and handle the historic resources on their property, while the natural resource trusts and conservation commissions are dealing with the natural resources. So there's a real partnership opportunity and partnership opportunities in grants as well. So we are interested in the protection district. We're interested in the historic farmsteads that are spread throughout that whole area that I was looking at in the last slide. And we're interested in the trails and interpretation, because the trails get people out of the landscape, and the trails can interpret not only the natural landscape, but the historic landscape. And because they're really one and the same. And I would just note that you do have a heritage landscape report that was prepared back in 2005, which really identified the landscapes that you all are probably familiar with, but it was a marker, and it's important to us that those landscapes were identified as being of historic importance. The landscape heritage landscape report was, is it DCNR? What do we hear? That led that, but the program's no longer active. But it was important. It was taken up specifically by Essex National Heritage Area, and it really is a document that's useful for us. Anyway, my point is the overlap between land conservation and historic preservation. With regard to your bylaws and regulations, you have most of the bylaws that are readily available to you through the state legislature. You're using them. The question is, can you use them more? You're missing the scenic byway, which really would be useful in those down country landscape areas, but there's not a lot of threat there either. But it still would be nice to add, and that was a recommendation certainly of your master plan, I think, and of your open space plan, to have that scenic byway, scenic roads bylaw. But so the question is, how well are the historic district, the historic district working? How well is your neighborhood conservation district working? And that's where we, need to have those conversations. And are there things that we can recommend to help with that? Demolition delay is always a challenge, but it's an important tool, especially if you develop a methodology for, once you identify a property that's being demolished that is preferably preserved, what do you do then? Can you, within the period of time that you have, work with the property owner to try and preserve the resource? And that, it's always difficult, and lots of experience is being developed in that realm by every town that has adopted it. With regard to zoning and subdivision, we would say, well, you have, your downtown overlay district, your historic mill area, your large estate condominium conversions. All of those are important to our historic preservation interests. What's lacking in your zoning and subdivision regulations are language that that we can help with, language that will help help identify historic resources when land is being developed. And it's really easy. It should be. It's not a regulatory regime. It's really having a developer, when a developer is coming in to develop a property, to make sure they know that they have historic resources on the property, have them identify it, and then tell them, have them tell the town what they're planning to do with them. And then what it really opens up is the opportunity for a negotiation. If the town wants to preserve, and this frequently happens on historic farms, certainly in the area where I live, where we have farms that are being developed into residential areas. You basically, the planning board and the selectmen get to negotiate with the landowner and save the historic buildings and perhaps even open space. So it's a point of negotiation. It's about information. And right now, neither of your documents have language that requires developers to identify historic resources that are in their properties. So my final two slides in this, and how am I? Not too bad. Final 2 points I want to make that we hope that the historic preservation plan can help address, and we want to raise attention to. The first is treatment. The approach to the treatment of historic buildings and landscapes. Our goal is to incorporate historic preservation principles and values into town-wide initiatives and processes. And I'd like to say that the Historical Commission should have their fingers in everybody else's pie. Not to cause problems, but to help them with information so that, again, we can incorporate historic resources and the values related to those historic resources into the town's process. And, just like the downtown redevelopment possibility. There are regulatory tools that can be used, and I just talked about those. You have them, you apply them in certain areas, but not in others. And so the question is, do you want to apply those regulatory tools? Is it to your benefit? Do you have the property owner support, neighborhood support, really, to use regulatory tools more extensively than you do? Thirdly is that no matter what we do, we need to have a robust public outreach. And we like to assign that also to the Historical Commission and other partners, because you have multiple partners here, to give property owners the information they need to take care of their historic resources, buildings and landscapes. But mostly, we need to be able to adapt to change. We know we need flexibility. We need to understand how can we accommodate change, whether you're talking about development or whether you're talking about an historic building itself, while preserving the integrity of the historic building and, in fact, even enhancing it. So it really is about providing information. I mentioned design guidelines. They're important to have that property owners can use to better understand and better approach the changes they're trying to make. Okay. And the principles that we're trying to address is, number one, prevent the loss of historic buildings. Number two, promote context-sensitive design within an historic context. And the most important thing with regard to the historic buildings and landscapes are the terms authenticity and integrity. We are not about historical appearance. Like, we are not trying to promote, false historicism. We're not trying to create false historic buildings. We're really trying to preserve authentic historic buildings and authentic historic building fabric. So, with regard to that, as I just mentioned, we need to be able to adapt to change, because change, needs to happen. And that means, some degree of flexibility. When changes are made, it should, when possible, be reversible. and following the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation, which provides general guidelines for a change. And really, we're trying to emphasize in everything community identity and character. That is, your history and your historic character is part of the quality of life of North Andover that everybody appeals, and that really also supports your prosperity. So the slides at the bottom are from, I think mostly from Machine Shop Village, and show four different buildings that have been that have had treatments. And so what we're trying to do, for instance, if you're in most of these historic mill villages and other places as well, people want to put on vinyl siding because then they don't have to paint. And while we, as an historic preservation approach, you don't encourage the use of vinyl siding, it is an overwhelming desire of many property owners, and so it can be accommodated. But when you do it, you want to make sure, I don't know if you see this, that the historic details aren't lost, that the vinyl siding is put on without loss of historic detailing, because the vinyl siding it's reversible. You can take it off. A later owner can take it off, but you want to put it on in a way that it does not destroy historic features of the building. And in this case, you see that the historic details actually have been perhaps eliminated, certainly covered over, and so that's what the design guidelines are for, is to really give people, show people how to do things in ways that enhance and don't lose the authenticity and the integrity of the historic building. One of the ways that we can promote public outreach is through interpretation. And so what we would like to put in front of you is the idea of a town-wide interpretive presentation, which can be implemented over time, when you're doing things like your downtown revitalization projects. And we see the lead partners in that being the Historical Commission, the Historical Society, the Trustees of Reservations, and the Improvement Society. And all for different roles, but work in collaboration. And we would suggest, and have already been talking with some of the Historical Society members, that the anchor site for interpretation of the town's history would be the Stevens Center. It's a great location. It's a great building, and it's a great entity. And then you have a whole number of attractions, of historic attractions that can be promoted. The Stevens Coolidge House, all of the Historical Society buildings, the Schofield Mill, and others. Historic buildings that are publicly accessible, don't have to be open all the time, but they're publicly accessible. You can, and sometimes they are open, but use them as attractions for a coordinated presentation of North Andover history. And then in addition to that, self-guided outdoor interpretive exhibits that publicly accessible public and nonprofit sites throughout the town, using public art, using downtown enhancements, it can be along trails, just a coordinated presentation of North Andover history from soup to nuts, managed by the primary historical entities. And it's an easy thing to do, because once you have the concept in place and you start working on the plan, you can just build on it over time. It's just not something that costs a lot of money to do at once. And you've got all the attractions already working. You've got the organizations already working. And so the self-guided outdoor interpretive exhibits, you've got a few of them right now. And public art, we like to encourage public art with an historic slant, with an historic message. And to really, the point of it is, well, what we try to say, the point of it is to attract visitors to your downtown to spend money. But our goal is really to educate residents about your history, and to build support for other preservation actions that are desirable. So we can talk more about that, and here's just photographs of a number of your historic sites, and some of that like down on the north end of downtown, the ponds and so on, that that are historic features but have not yet been interpreted. But you can certainly use trail interpretation as part of that, and I'm sure you're familiar with all of these buildings, which can play a part in this interpretive presentation idea. So we are going to put forward to our group a vision and goals. And briefly, the vision is North Andover has a rich and distinctive history that is cultivated to support community goals and enrich local quality of life, which we feel you've already been doing. Go ahead. And then goals, goal one is about preserving historic resources, preventing loss of historic buildings, because once they're gone, and they're irreplaceable. So we want to use them. And so the second goal is raising public awareness, which I've been talking about, the role that historic resources play in the character and quality of life of the town. The third goal is what I was referring to earlier about using history and identity in support of other town initiatives, growth, revitalization, conservation goals, whatever the town is doing, making historical perspective part of that process, and then providing informational resources to property owners of historic properties so that they can appropriately treat their buildings and landscapes. This is about the end, and I'm sorry I didn't ask you, and I've been talking too fast anyway, to ask you just to chime in and ask me questions as we went along, but we have plenty of time still. There was the survey that was done, just ended it, I think, last week. We had 329 responses, which is good. It's not a large proportion of your population, but it is the people who are interested enough to take the inventory. And it's a little higher than some other communities, in the 250 range that we've done. Beverly was in 550, but they had just completed their master plan, and they have all these neighborhood associations, so they were able to use that as a vehicle. But so 329 is pretty good, and only what was a quarter of the people who responded to the survey were in the outcountry area, the area in the South Booth, which was of interest to us. 61% considered their neighborhoods to be historic. 83% owned a non-historic property. So that's another interest. So it's not only people who own historic properties who are interested, but people who live in the town and recognize the history as important. Only 12% owned historic properties, and only 26 support or are involved in a history organization. That means there's a lot of opportunity here for membership in the Historical Society and other organizations. So, and so I just have a few slides that show the result. And I know you can't read these too much, but question number 3 was, what historic neighborhoods have strong history of character? I mean, everybody knows them. But, I was interested in the Old Center, Mill District, Library District. I was interested that people thought the Library District and downtown and the lake vicinity all thought they have strong historic character. So that was a positive outcome for us. Question number 4, what do you think of when you hear about historic preservation in North Andover? I know you can't read those, but the top one is, what's interesting is that this was all that, check all that apply. And they did. And so there's a full range here. So it's not like so the top one was nonprofit owned historic buildings. The second one's historic farms and farmland. Third one's historic mills. The fourth one's managed landscape, historic villages, privately owned historic homes, mill neighborhoods. I mean, scenic roads down here, country estates, religious property. I mean, that's a pretty good response and pretty even. So that they're not just focused on one thing. So that's part of the message that we want to project, and we see that we've got, among this group at least, we have a good response for that. What types of historic resources do you think are most at risk? And these questions sort of get to the heart of what is helpful to us in developing the plan. The top one is historic farms and farmlands. You don't have a lot of historic farms, but there's a clear interest both not only in this question, but in a lot of the responses that we got. Each of these questions had, other at the bottom, and people were encouraged to write in. And we have all those comments on spreadsheets. And the historic farms came up a lot and a lot and a lot. So clearly that was a strong interest among this group who were taking the inventory. The second was landscape, burial grounds, and parks being in threat, individual historic buildings, old center, historic mills. This is historic documents and stories. I was interested in that got applied. In any case, the upper ones are an interesting group for us because it does give us a sense of what's on people's attention right now and what they think are under threat. Question 7, what 3 causes do you most think put these historic resources at risk? And, is growth and development and incompatible development are the top 2. And, that's not surprising for a community that is prosperous and is continuing to prosper and is continuing to grow and develop and infill. So that really gets into the kinds of things I was talking about, is that, adapting to change, but preserving historic resources and using historic character to influence that change. And so the rest of these down here, the cost of preservation techniques, neglect, abandonment, is relatively small in terms of what they thought was most problematic. So it's growth and development, incompatible new development. And question 8 was, which educational and commemorative tools and actions would you like to see used more? These are educational and commemorative. So interesting to me, the highest rating one is digitize and provide online access to information. And that's not one I expected to be up there. Community and neighborhood events is the blue one. Public programming and interpretive exhibits. The public programming is the 3rd, interpretive exhibits 4th. That's right in the heart of the slides I was showing you earlier. Walking tours. And so there's a whole range of educational tools that can be used to provide more information, and we're hoping to provide support for those through the plan and through the actions of partners. Question 9, which regulatory or financial tools and actions would you most like to see? Mostly they were concerned about, they mentioned the zoning and subdivision. There's large support for the scenic byway, that's the blue. Additional local historic districts, I think, is the yellow one. Demolition delay is there. So in federal and state tax credits, that is higher than it should be, really, for what we're talking about here, which I can go into, but won't, unless you ask me. Become designated as a certified local government. That's something that the Historical Commission would do, that we would recommend doing. Anyway, zoning bylaw and subdivision, I can talk about that afterwards a little bit, because there's not a lot you can do in historic preservation, except you provide yourself with negotiating leverage through those entities. Favorite historic, we had a question about what are your favorite historic resources, and everybody knew the obvious ones. And so the lists, the farms came up again and again and again, but we would all have put these on the list as well. And so everybody who was answering, and we have a whole page of responses here, but they're repetitive, and these all come up again and again and again. So they know what they are. Go ahead. We are particularly interested in potential National Register listings. What do people think? The good news is that most of the suggested listings are already on the National Register, which is also bad news because they didn't know that. So others that are not on the National Register that were listed, the Stevens Estate, the farms, again, that we talked about, could be done with a thematic listing. And then some others that were existed that were mentioned that we will look into. And then we also asked, go ahead, about local historic districts and neighborhood conservations. Again, we got the same thing, is that everybody listed all the ones that were on the favorites slide, which are already within either the old center local historic district or the machine shop village. So they, again and again, people put on the old center, the common, Academy Road, individual properties, individual resources, the burial grounds, and so on. But we did get really strong support for the library area, which was new to us. Definitely. And that, the library is largely within that area of inventory buildings I was talking about. And downtown, and again, farms. So that's it. What we would like to do is, I would like to have some water, and we'd like to just talk. So Andrew has we can get that for you, and give you a microphone if you'd like to speak. So questions, comments? Here you go.
Oh, hi.
It's on.
Hi there. I came for something that I didn't think I did. I'm in the wrong place for this, what I wanted to say. Except one thing you said about robust public outreach. You mentioned that in one of the slides. And you considered it membership in different organizations. Do you have any suggestions on how to increase the membership? Because we've been trying to do it for decades, and we want to know if you have any suggestions on how to do that.
Well, what I meant by the robust public outreach is really having documents, events, interpretation, things that will be put in front of people as they go about their daily lives. And so they may not be going out to learn about North Andover history, but they'll walk by a piece of artwork that talks about the mills or something. So the public outreach is aimed at getting the result you're talking about. Increasing people's interest, helping them understand the history, and helping them understand how the history is part of community character.
Curiosity.
That they're already, supports their property values. And so we're hoping that through robust public outreach, people will get involved in different ways, and one way would be through membership in organizations.
The other part of what I have here is maintaining a robust commercial, industrial, and business environment. Now, this is all about buildings and places. I think there has to be one human being added to this. Just one. And it's the one that I gave you with,
we got
exactly.
It. And that was Ann Bradstreet.
Ann
Bradstreet. So
she is such a draw if used correctly from all over the world.
Right.
And she's not being utilized, and she was here for most of her life.
Right.
Lived here, had two of her children here at least, and wrote most of her poetry, a lot of her poetry here, and then died here.
So what we would want to do is incorporate that into the public outreach, into the interpretation.
Somewhere
where did she live?
That.
Where did she go? What did she do? And tell those stories.
Oh, yeah.
Use those stories to generate that interest. And there may be others as well. I mean, obviously other people.
But she'd be the first one. This is the Valley of the Poets. We live in the Valley of the Poets. And people don't know it yet. They're going to.
So I think we would want to, so what we would suggest is that ultimately is that the key partners in interpretation put together an interpretive plan. It doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be expensive. And they know the history. And so what are the stories that you can tell that will engage people?
Yeah.
And how do you associate those stories with different places?
Yeah.
And so, develop an interpretive plan. So there were other Ann Bradstreet.
Could that be added to this then?
Well, yeah. The next step, we're going to fill this out in more detail.
Okay, so it is not just building; it could be people.
Oh yeah. So we're well,
okay.
I'm sorry. We're talking about storytelling.
I didn't know that.
When we talk about interpretation, we're talking about storytelling. When you're telling story, it's not just about buildings.
Okay.
It's about people.
So
we're talking about mill workers. So we're what were their lives like? The farmers, the farms. What were their lives like?
Why were they here? What did they do here?
Right.
Yep. Okay.
And this is
Kathy,
what they
you wanna
did.
use this? No. Got a question? Oh, Ann?
Ann. Hi. My name is Ann Erickson. Oh, I'm sorry. I think I can talk.
I wasn't pointing to.
I'm not used to a microphone. I was happy, and I think my friends at the table were happy to see that you had the Schofield Mill presented and you mentioned it. And I guess that the thing is, the Schofield Mill has a history.
Yep.
It's not really in, the Mill District, but I guess that to have a purpose would help it to be preserved.
Yeah.
So,
Well, we're really glad that the town has it, and I understand that there is work that needs to be done to it, but it's an easy building to work on. It's wood.
and it has a very long history.
A very long history, and I do consider it in the Mill District because the Mill District goes all the way to the Merrimack, all along all the water bodies.
Right.
And I don't want to be out of place, but in my view, the Schofield Mill is in a place that sort of anchors the northwest Main Street, and so it's right next to the Sutton Mill.
I mean, it became part of the Sutton Mill eventually.
Yeah.
But the thing is, it is, because it's small and somewhat insignificant. Look, if people don't know what it is, but
Well,
but it
the
has-
smaller races are
Right.
the most significant because
Right.
they survive. It's small. It's simply because it survived. So it's an early one. It came before the big brick ones, I'm assuming, and so we see it as a potential interpretive venue. So open. Maybe has exhibits inside, and it's open sometimes, not all the time. But then it has outdoor exhibits so that people can walk Main Street. So we see it as a town enhancement that can relate to the trail system. So we're not the ones to say, but we see opportunities for that building relatively inexpensively to be an interpretive asset.
well, that's I thank you, because I think that's like a cause that some of us are interested in.
Right, and we've heard a number of people who have spoken to us about that and pointed it out. So we have taken notice.
Thank you.
I wanted to circle back on a statement made. Preserve the authentic historic building fabric. Could you walk down that road a little more with a little
Yeah.
clarification?
So I want to distinguish between something that's made to look historic and something that really is historic. And so when you've got, and by fabric, I'm talking the building materials. So I am talking about buildings.
So could you talk about building
Fabric.
materials?
Building materials.
Yes.
Siding, windows.
Yeah. So authentic. What does authentic mean to you?
Authentic
Original
means
materials?
Original or part of, now a building can change over time. Changes that happen to an historic building during different historic periods can be significant to the building's development as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
So that said, by authentic, I mean it's related to an historic period of the building. So you may have a building that was built in 1792, and the windows were all changed in 1870. Those changes in 1870 are still, from our perspective, within its historic time frame. It's what we call period of significance. So even though a building may change over time, those changes we generally consider historic part of the building's evolution. So we would want to see those 1870 windows retained, but we would rather not that they be taken out and put in with new windows. We would rather see them.
So building materials evolve over time, and the reason that our ancestors didn't use composite was
Right.
that it hadn't been invented. They would have
Right.
been delighted if it had.
Right.
We need to be pragmatic. Going forward, old houses, I own one, take enormous amounts of money to maintain. And when you make something out of wood, over time it will rot. So it requires enormous amounts of money continuing. It's my belief historic buildings are more likely to survive if we use some of the newly evolved materials that have a 50-year life and allow the building, the greater good of the building, the survival. So could you speak to that issue?
Yeah, composites are an important preservation tool. And usually, generally the rule of thumb we would make is that if the building has historic materials that are not deteriorated, that they'd be maintained. And mainly, especially with buildings here, we're talking about wood, means they need to be painted. So when material is threatened or deteriorated and needs to be replaced, composites are a good use, especially in vulnerable areas like dormers where you can't get to them. And so composites are used regularly in historic preservation as a replacement material, but they're used carefully. So what I wouldn't do is, take all the siding off your historic building because you don't want to paint it every 20 years and put up, synthetic materials. That would not be encouraged. But if you have materials that are deteriorating and impossible to maintain, then composite materials are a very appropriate use. But you use them in a way that it replicates the historic materials that you have to replace.
Thank you.
And so that's why design guidelines are an important tool. I know the Machine Shop Village has design guidelines built into their bylaw, but we just completed preparation of a set of design guidelines for the city of Worcester, of their 4 historic districts. And there are 3 chapters in those guidelines that are related to building materials, new construction, so on and so forth. You could take those chapters and just apply them. They're not unique to Worcester. So I would encourage you to develop design guidelines, but if you can't develop them, you can use guidelines like the ones we prepared for Worcester or for other places, because the recommendations in those guidelines are applicable to most historic places. Questions? Yes, please.
In going through the report you presented tonight, there's quite a bit of focus on buildings, historic buildings. And I'm curious, and you mentioned one just a moment ago, the means of transportation as far as they relate to the history, including the Merrimack River, which kind of is not as approachable as it might have been years ago, and the railroad and other historic roads. And you also mentioned the trolley system.
Yeah.
So I'm curious how that might fit into some of the storytelling, some of the historic preservation.
Well, I'm certain it's certainly part of the story, and going different modes of transportation, and I don't want to say we're just interested in buildings; we're in landscapes too, and that's why I get obsessed with the surface geology map. But it's about storytelling, and until we actually looked at the 1926 map, and I saw that trolleys, because the trolley lines are all shown here. I don't know the history of the trolleys, but I really am interested in them. So, and I don't know the history of the port, the river, how the relationship to the river was. It's something I'm familiar with yet. But I think, the history of transportation is part of the evolution. I mean, the difference between the streetcars and the automobile is phenomenal. So it really develops, it's really important to landscape patterns.
I mentioned earlier when we were introduced that I'm part of the Trails Committee in
Yeah.
North Andover, and one of the interesting things I can't quite understand is why we haven't capitalized more on the possibility of
a rail trail. Well, you have that opportunity, and I know in the downtown redevelopment, from Sutton Street to the Davis and Ferber Mills, that trail, we'd love to see that happen along the rail trail. You need a bridge, but we would love to see that happen because that's a venue for storytelling. Once you get down country, it might be more difficult. In a lot of areas where I live in Pennsylvania, we have this, if you haven't already preserved the right-of-way, it's tough to get it back. And then a lot of people don't like trails in their backyard. So you need to work with property owners and stuff. So, rail trails are important. Your nature trails, your drumlins, your lakes, and a lot of opportunity for, and again, we just sort of see this integration between natural history and human history, and there's stories to tell that relate to both. So we would want to see the trails as part, if you do some sort of interpretive initiative, we would see the trails as being a big part of that. And then what we would look to you all to do is say, well, what are the stories we want to tell? Whether it's different little micro eco communities, or it's whether, how this land was used before it became woodland. Massachusetts has a really interesting history, and its agricultural history, and how, when agriculture declined, the woods came back, and that's the sort of history I see in the outcountry area. But we would hope that you all would be engaged in thinking about what stories you would like to tell to get more people to come out as amenities on your trails. Yes, sir. Wait a second. We have to use the microphone because this is being recorded. And unless you use the microphone, your voice won't be heard.
Who in Worcester owns the design guidelines that you mentioned?
The town.
And so who or
the city,
who or what office would disseminate that information?
Planning department.
Planning department.
And and they have an historic preservation. They have an historic preservation staff person, but you can talk to their director of planning.
Who alerts the developer who comes to town that such an office exists?
The design guidelines are intended to apply to the whole city.
Okay.
That is, they're intended to be useful for every historic neighborhood.
Sure.
And most of their buildings, like yours, are made of wood.
Right.
So they're mostly, the guidelines are mainly related to wood. And it's not brain surgery. It's, people. When someone's developing a property within one of their historic districts, they have to go through a design review, just like you do if you go through and want to build something in Center Village. You go through the Historic District Commission. So they don't have an Historic District Commission. Their Historical Commission handles it. And so they go through the same kind of design review, and the design guidelines are intended to provide a common touchstone for developer and the Historical Commission to use in assessing proposed changes. So does that answer your question?
Well, yes and no. Where's the authority?
The authority is in the bylaw that they passed, creating historic districts.
Right.
Just like
that, I understand that.
Yeah.
And a historic district is different from any general neighborhood in the town of North Andover, where a builder may be looking for guidance, but if there's no historic district in place, the builder doesn't get any guidance,
right,
unless he knows where to go or unless someone approaches him.
Well, that's the goal of the public outreach, and we would assign that task to the Historical Commission.
To the Historical Commission.
Well, they're in our mind, they're the ones who kind of are, particularly with regard to the treatment of historic buildings. They should be doing everything they can, using all the mechanisms they can, is to get information out.
Okay, to get recognizing that they don't have authority.
They don't have authority,
to enforce any of it.
Correct.
But you're suggesting the Historic Commission be the vehicle that supplies the public with
Right.
design
Right.
criteria.
Right.
Okay.
That's their job, is to get the information out there and to help people. It's educational. It's
Okay.
educational.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
There is already a process for that. If you live in the Old Center Historic District on a building permit, there's a little box.
Right.
When it gets checked, that creates a notice that somebody in a historic district.
Right.
It would seem to me that is the place and the responsibility for passing out information. How would the historical commission know?
Well, the historic within the Old Center Historic District and within the Machine Shop Village Neighborhood Conservation District, they both have the same process or a similar process, and so they get flagged by the building department when an application goes in, and the application goes to one of those two entities. What I think he's referring to is neighborhoods that are not designated regulatory, that have no regulatory designation. And so how would a owner in a historic building outside in a historic neighborhood but not within a regulatory neighborhood get information? And that really has to be done through public outreach, right? Yeah.
Are all buildings prior to World War II historic?
I would say you should look at them. You know, when we start, so that's why I showed those maps from the 1926 and what hasn't been inventoried. All of those neighborhoods south of downtown, the neighborhoods along High Street, have not been inventoried, and those buildings are of historic interest to me. And as neighborhoods, so they're not necessarily individually historically significant, but you put them together as a neighborhood, and that neighborhood is historically significant.
Just to address the idea that the Historic Commission mostly works with individuals who own the property who want to sell it. It has been my experience, I would say 9 times out of 10, when a house that has is in a historic district or anything like that, the house has already been sold to a developer, and he is damn well not interested in dealing with the Historic Commission at all. He wants to either divide the property, if it's an older farmhouse out country, he wants to have 3 lots there. Tone deaf would be the nicest way I could put it, truly. So on the odd occasion, we might have an individual whose house is up for sale and somebody else wants to buy it, and because it's in a district, they know they have to come to us. But my experience, and I'm sure many other towns, because God didn't make any more land, and as you said, we're just about built out here in North Andover, so they're all looking for a big property that they can divide and make more money out of. And of course, the developer is offering wonderful money, and you can't blame people for wanting to get the most money they can for their property. But that has been the experience on the Historic Commission, that we mostly deal with developers, and they do have to come to us. We do vote on whatever and all that. They are not happy, and our success rate on, we've pulled demolition delay since it's been available to us 3 times, and 1 time we were successful. And the only reason why we were successful is because COVID helped us out. And that's a long story, but the presence of the pandemic, the man rethought it and et cetera, and he did move the house, and that was our one success story. But that's all I wanted to say. Most of the time, the house is already bought by a developer. So you're dealing with someone that is just not interested. He sees money, and that's what he wants.
Right.
So.
Well, I would say that's the challenge we're dealing with. And
Yeah.
so, what we're trying to do is put use as many tools as we can, but that's not, we're not going to stop that from happening. That's the challenge that we're dealing with. Demolition delay is a good thing, but it's hard to get. It's hard. You don't frequently don't get the result that you want. Any other questions now? And I'd be happy to stay for a while if you want to come up and speak to me. So,
would you take a question from staff?
Yes.
I'll give you one question. So, given that you've done these historic plans in other cities and towns in Massachusetts and elsewhere, is it unusual, our structure here in North Andover, or is it not? Is it common where we have separate historic district commissions?
Yeah.
Okay. And a separate historical commission.
Yeah.
And here's where I'm going with this. Are there other structures, are there other governance structures where, for instance, there'd be an overarching historical commission?
Yeah.
Where all certificates of appropriateness would have to be applied for under the umbrella of a larger, or an overarching historical commission instead of separate district commissions?
Yeah. Let me give you two examples, and I would say that you have the right structure, and I would not look to combine them, because the Historic Districts Commission is always very focused on, they've got blinders on, and they're interested only in the buildings that are going on, and because people have limited time, volunteers, they're very focused on that, and they don't think about any of the bigger issues. The job of the Historical Commission is to look at the bigger issues. So they're not focused on individual buildings within the geographic areas. They're interested in larger, town-wide, doing inventories, things that are town-wide. And again, because you have limited capacity within any one of these entities, those differences in focus are important. Now, sometimes the two entities don't speak to each other. That's not good. And so I gave a list of what we considered the primary historic preservation organizations. You've got a lot of them, more than most towns do. I mean, the Improvement Society, the Historical Society. So you've got a lot of different entities. And one of our jobs, and one of the, hope the preservation plan helps facilitate, is to get those organizations collaborating together. And as some people have told me, the same people on every board. So you have a core group of folks who are engaged in the community, and they seem to know what's happening from group to group. But I would say you have more entities than most communities. I would not combine them because it would dilute. So in Worcester, as an example, they have an historical commission. All they do is demolition delay and review their historic. They don't have an historic districts commission. And they're talking about now splitting it off because they're not getting into the big citywide stuff done that your historical commission should be working on. They are focused solely on what an historic districts commission would be focused on, plus demolition delay. So they do a really great job at what they do, but they're very narrowly focused and they're not looking at the big picture. Over in Sudbury, which we did a plan for Sudbury, and again, they have an historical commission that's looking things townwide, and very engaged, and then their historic districts commission again is very specifically focused on their narrow historic districts. Their problem is they weren't talking to each other, and so overall structure, and we can talk about this further because you've probably seen things. The overall structure is good here. Whether the entities how the entities are functioning is another matter, and deserves more conversation from those involved.
Okay, thank you.
And you've brought that up before, so I think I would look forward to talking to you more about that in more detail. Anything else right now? Then I want to thank you, and I really want to thank the town for asking us to come, and it's fun for us, and we really enjoy getting to know the town. It's a pleasure. So thank you very much. Right.
Do you want to close this out? I don't know if there's anything else to say, but.